Welcome to the Deep Dive. We take complex topics, break them down, and hopefully give you some essential knowledge you can use. Today we're tackling something huge, something that affects almost everyone. Mental health in the workplace. We're going to be digging into a recent academic paper. It's called A Mentally Healthy Framework to Guide Employers and Policymakers by Mark Deddy and his colleagues. And this deep dive, it's really about understanding this growing concern, mental health problems at work, not just for us as individuals, but for whole organizations and even national economies.
Yeah, and what's really fascinating, I think, is seeing how the whole conversation around workplace safety has shifted. Historically, it was all about, physical hazards, slippery floors, dangerous machines, that kind of thing. But this paper really highlights a massive shift towards understanding and actually mitigating these psychosocial risks. These are the sort of hidden factors in our jobs and our workplaces that can seriously impact our mental well-being. It's realizing these invisible things matter just as much.
Exactly, the invisible stuff, safety for your mind, not just your body. So our mission today is to cut through all that complexity and explore this updated framework they propose. It's designed to help guide employers, policymakers, anyone really, in creating workplaces that are genuinely mentally healthy. Get ready for, I think, some surprising insights and definitely some practical takeaways. Okay, so let's unpack this first big idea. Why is workplace mental health suddenly being talked about as like the major public health issue for modern workplaces? What's the impact beyond, individual suffering, which is obviously serious in itself?
Well, if you connect it to the bigger picture, the paper really hammers home that mental health issues in the workforce have these huge knock-on effects. It's not just personal consequences, right? There are significant financial costs for businesses. We're talking serious productivity loss, much higher staff turnover, people being off sick absenteeism, and then huge healthcare costs. Things like compensation claims, early retirement payouts, it all adds up. So addressing this isn't just like the right thing to do, it's actually a social and a financial imperative.
Right, so it hits the bottom line. It's not just a nice-to-have thing. It's actually good business sense. But what exactly are these psychosocial risks you mentioned? Can we make that a bit more concrete?
Yeah, absolutely. The research draws really strong links between specific workplace factors and, well, poor mental health outcomes. The paper groups them into three main buckets. First, you've got job factors. These are things baked into the work itself, like mind-numbing monotony, or the opposite, just an excessive workload, constantly working long hours, or maybe a lack of clarity about what your role actually is, or having no say, no autonomy in how you do your job.
Okay, yeah, I can see how those would grind you down. Things like high demand but low control rate. What's the second category?
The second one covers operational and team factors. This is more about the sort of environment and the people around you. So issues like never getting recognition for your work, feeling insecure about your job constantly, and importantly, poor relationships with colleagues or managers. Think lack of support, conflict, even bullying and harassment, that kind of stuff.
That's social fabric at work. Makes sense. And the third?
The third is systems and policy factors. This is the real big picture stuff. It's about the overall organizational culture, how fair are the procedures? Is there a sense of justice in the workplace? The company values, basically, how things operate at a macro level.
Got it. Job, team, system. That covers a lot. Now, here's something that really jumped out at me. The paper argues that even though we've had models for this before, there hasn't been enough clear direction. And crucially, the recommendations needed updating. Why now? What made this new framework so necessary right now?
That's a really important point. Why the update? Well, the paper points to three big developments that really push this forward. First, the World Health Organization, the WHO, they released their first ever comprehensive guidelines specifically on mental health at work. That was back in 2022. And alongside that came new meta-reviews, basically big studies pulling together all the existing evidence. So a major global benchmark was set.
Okay, the WHO guidelines, that's significant. What else?
Second, there have been some pretty major changes in laws and regulations, both nationally and internationally. Think about things like the ISO 45003 standard, which gives specific guidance on managing psychosocial risks. These changes basically shifted more responsibility onto employers. The legal landscape changed.
Right, so the rules are catching up. And the third reason?
And third, it was just a really good opportunity, timing-wise, to bring together concepts from all these different, sometimes fragmented, older frameworks. The idea was to create one single, unifying model that's more comprehensive, more consistent, and importantly, more actionable for employers and policymakers who are trying to figure out what to actually do.
Makes sense. Bringing it all together.
Yeah.
Okay, so this updated framework is built around three core pillars: protect, promote, and respond. Can you walk us through what those mean in practice?
Sure. These pillars basically classify all the different strategies based on where a worker might be on the mental health spectrum. So, protect strategies, these are what we call primary prevention. It's all about identifying work related hazards before they cause harm, and then managing those hazards to minimize risk and prevent psychological injury. Think of it like putting up guardrails on a dangerous road before an accident happens. Employers often have legal duties here.
Okay, so protect is proactive prevention. Got it. What's promote?
Promote strategies go a step further than just stopping bad things from happening. They focus on actively enhancing overall well-being, helping employees flourish, helping them thrive. And the great thing is, these strategies benefit everyone, regardless of their current mental health state. It's about building positive capacity.
Building the positive. I like that. And the last one, respond.
And response strategies. These are the interventions for when a worker is actually experiencing distress or mental ill health. They're designed to help facilitate recovery, provide support, make sure people get the help they need, whether they're still at work, maybe off sick, or trying to return to work. It's about support when things get tough.
Okay, so protect, promote, respond. It's a full life cycle approach, really. Prevent harm, build well-being, and support recovery. But where do these actually happen within a company? You mentioned different levels earlier.
Exactly. That's where the 4 workplace strategy levels come into play. They tell you where in the organization you should target your efforts. And they line up pretty neatly with those risk factors we discussed. So first up is the systems and policy level. This is the highest level, the big picture stuff.
Yeah.
We're talking company-wide policies, procedures, the overall organizational culture, the values that guide everything. Think HR rules, leadership buy-in, that kind of thing.
The foundation, basically. Okay, what's next?
Then you drop down to the operations and team level. This is about initiatives focused on the sort of immediate work environment, optimizing how teams interact, how people communicate, the general social climate. It's about making the day-to-day interactions healthier.
How people actually work together.
Gotcha.
And then,
Then we get to the job level. This is about changing the work itself, altering the design of specific tasks, how work is delivered, the actual content of what people do day in, day out. Are the tasks meaningful? Is there autonomy? That's the focus here.
right down to the tasks on your to-do list.
Okay.
And the final level.
And finally, the individual level. This covers programs delivered directly to employees. Often these aim to help individuals modify how they perceive things, build skills, or cope with workplace conditions, rather than changing the conditions themselves. Think resilience workshops or mindfulness training.
Okay, that breakdown makes so much sense. Systems, operations team, job, individual. It turns a massive challenge into, well, slightly more manageable chunks. So now for the really crucial bit. What does the evidence actually say works? What does this paper highlight as effective interventions at these different levels across way? Protect, promote, and respond. Let's start with protect. What are some standout ways to actually minimize psychological harm at work based on the evidence?
Okay, for Protect at the systems level, the paper really emphasizes psychosocial risk assessments and the management measures that follow. But here's the interesting bit. It notes that traditional risk assessments, the kind used for physical safety, often fall short for psychosocial risks. They're more complex, harder to measure.
How so? What makes them harder?
Well, it's tough to pinpoint, say, the exact dose of excessive workload that becomes harmful, or quantify the impact of poor communication. It's not like measuring noise levels. So the paper really highlights this need for better tools, maybe involving worker surveys more effectively, and much clearer guidance for employers on what corrective actions they should actually take based on those assessments. There's a gap there.
That definitely sounds like a challenge. What about protecting people at the operations and team level?
Here, manager mental health training comes up as being really key. The evidence suggests that giving managers proper, skill-based training can significantly improve their knowledge about mental health, change their attitudes for the better, and, crucially, improve their supportive behaviors towards their staff.
So better trained managers can make a real difference.
They can definitely improve their supportive actions. Now, the paper is careful to note that directly linking this training to measurable improvements in employee mental health outcomes is still an area needing more solid research. But equipping managers seems like a really important protective step.
That seems very practical, yeah. Okay, let's shift to the promote pillar. How do we actively build that positive well-being?
Right, promoting thriving. At the systems level, the paper points to things like the total worker health (TWH) approach. These are quite comprehensive programs that don't just focus on one thing, but integrate organizational changes and individual support.
Mhm.
And they've shown positive impacts on well-being. And absolutely vital here is fostering a psychologically safe environment.
Ah, yes, psychological safety. We hear that term a lot now. What does it mean in this context?
It's essentially creating a climate where employees feel safe enough to speak up, to share ideas, ask questions, raise concerns, even admit they made a mistake, all without fearing negative consequences like being embarrassed, rejected, or punished. That feeling of trust and openness, it's fundamental for promoting well-being and actually innovation, too.
That sounds like the kind of place everyone wants to work, right? Where you can bring your whole self. What about promoting well-being at the job level?
At the job level, a really powerful concept highlighted is job crafting. This isn't a top-down mandate, it's more bottom-up. It's about empowering employees to proactively reshape their own jobs to some extent.
How does that work, like redesigning your job description?
Sort of. It could involve changing the boundaries of your tasks, maybe taking on more tasks you find meaningful, altering how you interact with colleagues, or even just reframing how you think about your work. It's about giving individuals some agency to make their work fit them better. And research links this to better health, higher job satisfaction, and more engagement. It's about finding ways to make your current role work better for you.
I really like that idea.
Hmm.
Job crafting, giving people some control. Okay, finally, the respond pillar. What really stands out for supporting employees who are already experiencing distress?
For Respond, looking at the individual level, things like employee assistance programs, EAPs, and workplace counseling are very common, as you might expect. Now, the paper acknowledges their effectiveness can really depend on the quality of the help provided. But generally, recent reviews do support their ability to help improve symptoms of things like anxiety, stress, depression. And interestingly, they can also help reduce presenteeism.
Presenteeism, that's when you're physically at work but not really functioning, right?
Exactly. You're there, but not productive, maybe because of stress or mental health issues. So EAPs can potentially help with that too.
Okay, EAPs seem generally positive if they're good quality. But what about those universal mental health screening tools some companies use? Are they a good response strategy?
This is where the paper urges caution, and it's a really important nuance. While some older studies maybe suggested benefits from universal mental health screening, more recent, robust evidence paints a different picture. It suggests these tools only seem to be beneficial if they are directly and seamlessly linked to enhanced access to actual treatment and good follow-up support. So just screening people isn't enough.
Apparently not. If you screen someone, identify they might be struggling, but then there's no clear, immediate pathway to help. The screening itself might actually cause harm. It could increase anxiety or distress without providing any solution. In fact, the paper notes that current international guidelines generally don't recommend universal screening in workplaces for this very reason, the potential risk if not linked to robust support systems. It really makes you question how and why some organizations might be using them.
That's a really critical point, intent versus impact. Okay, and another thing that surprised me in the response section was the discussion around psychological debriefing after something traumatic happens at work. I thought that was standard practice.
It used to be, yes, but that's a great example of how evidence evolves. Research over time has pretty consistently found that immediate, often mandatory debriefing sessions, where everyone talks about the trauma right away, they're generally of minimal benefit. And worse, they can sometimes even be harmful, potentially re-traumatizing people or interfering with natural coping mechanisms. So what's the recommended approach now instead of debriefing?
The current guidelines favor what's called watchful waiting, basically, giving people space and time coupled with psychological first aid, PFA. Now, PFA isn't therapy. It's more practical, immediate support. It focuses on reducing that initial distress, making sure people's basic needs are met, promoting adaptive coping strategies like connecting with social support, maybe reducing work demands for a bit. It's about providing compassionate, practical support right after an event, rather than forcing everyone to talk about it before they're ready. Stabilization, not forced processing.
That shift makes a lot of sense, focusing on needs and natural recovery. Okay, so stepping back now, looking at this whole framework, protect, promote, respond across all those levels. What's the big picture takeaway for our listeners or for employers trying to figure this all out?
Well, I think one crucial thing the paper is very honest about is the remaining knowledge gap. There's still a lot we don't know definitively about what makes workplace interventions truly effective. And a big reason for that is just how incredibly complex it is to run really rigorous scientific trials, like randomized controlled trials for these kinds of multi-layered interventions inside actual messy real-world workplaces. It's just hard to isolate variables and prove cause and effect definitively.
And didn't the paper also mention a kind of bias in the research? A tendency for workplaces, and maybe researchers too, to favor those individual level changes, like focusing on teaching employees resilience instead of, say, fixing systemic workload issues.
Yes, that's a really perceptive point you picked up on. The evidence base often looks strongest at the individual level, partly because those studies are just easier and cheaper to conduct. You can run a workshop, measure skills before and after. It requires less organizational upheaval, less investment compared to, say, redesigning core work processes or changing the entire culture.
But the risk there is,
The huge risk, as the paper points out, is that this focus on the individual can inadvertently place the entire burden of mental well-being onto the employee. It risks overlooking or even implicitly accepting those underlying operational or systemic factors, the crazy workload, the toxic team that might actually be driving the problems in the first place. It's like telling someone to bail water out of a boat with a huge hole in it instead of fixing the hole.
that's a powerful analogy. So just teaching coping skills isn't enough if the environment itself is inherently stressful or damaging.
Precisely. And it's entirely possible, even probable, that the interventions with the biggest positive impact are actually those organization-wide systemic changes. But if the evidence for those is harder to gather and slower to build because they're so complex to study properly, then we risk not fully understanding or implementing what truly constitutes best practice for workplace mental health on a large scale.
So the conclusion seems to be that creating a genuinely mentally healthy workplace isn't about finding a single magic bullet or just rolling out a few standalone programs.
Absolutely not. That's the core message. While we need to evaluate individual components, of course, the paper really stresses that we need holistic, multi-level approaches, strategies that support all workers, wherever they are on the mental health spectrum of preventing harm, promoting flourishing, responding effectively. And these strategies need to involve all levels of the organization, from top leadership and policy right down to the design of individual jobs and team interactions. This deep dive really shows us that building a mentally healthy workplace is a systematic, coordinated, ongoing effort. It's about preventing harm, yes, but also reducing hazards, supporting recovery, and fundamentally valuing employee well-being as essential to the business, not just an optional extra.
Wow. This really reframes the whole issue, doesn't it? It makes you think so much more deeply about the huge impact our work environments have day in, day out on our mental health. It's such a powerful reminder that workplace safety has got to mean so much more than just, watching out for physical hazards. It's got to include psychological safety too.
It really does. And this updated framework, it offers a valuable roadmap. But as the paper also implies, every workplace is different. There's no one-size-fits-all solution. The real key, I think, is for organizations to genuinely consider what's achievable, what's relevant for their specific context, their specific people, and to move beyond maybe tokenistic gestures towards strategies that are truly integrated into how the business operates.
So thinking about everything we've discussed, what's the one thing that really stands out to you listening right now? How might you start looking at your own workplace, maybe even just your own role or team, through this lens of protect, promote, and respond? What change, maybe even a small one, could make a difference right where you are? Something to think about.